the time a pig was hanged for murder, history's craziest animal trials txt. Good evening. As you listen to the sound of my voice, you might begin to notice your breath deepening, slowing. Allow me to be your gentle guide tonight, leading you away from the sharp edges of your day and into the strange, quiet, and frankly quite baffling world of medieval animal trials. It's a place where our modern logic doesn't quite fit, and that's perfectly all right. There is nothing to figure out here, only a story to gently unfold. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. And if you feel so inclined, you could even leave a comment, letting me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is there in your quiet corner of the world. It's a nice way to feel a quiet connection across the distance, a small reminder that others are also settling in for a story. And so, find that gentle darkness in your room, perhaps with a soft blanket pulled a little closer. As we begin our slow drift into tonight's tale, let's imagine you are there, not as a king or a knight or a powerful merchant. No, just as you are, dropped quietly into the middle of a European town in, let's say, the 14th century. The first thing you notice is the mud. It seems to be a fundamental element of the universe here, a thick, sticky stew that tries to claim your shoes with every step. The air is a rich tapestry of smells: wood smoke, damp earth, livestock, and something vaguely like boiled cabbage. Looking at the state of the roads and the general lack of what you might call infrastructure, you'd probably be lucky to make it through the first day without some kind of comical, yet deeply inconvenient mishap. But just as you're contemplating the sheer challenge of walking in a straight line, you hear a commotion. It isn't a cheerful festival, nor is it an angry riot. It's something else, something with a strange, formal weight to it. You follow the sound, rounding a corner where a timber-framed house leans tiredly against its neighbor. And that's when you see it. A small procession of grim-faced men, led by a bailiff in a slightly too large hat, is marching a prisoner through the center of the town square. You crane your neck, expecting to see a captured thief or a wild-eyed heretic. But as the group gets closer, you have to blink and then blink again because you're quite sure you're seeing it wrong. The prisoner, walking with a lead around its neck, is not a person. It's a pig. A rather large, very confused-looking pig who seems entirely unaware of the gravity of the situation. It winks softly, perhaps wondering if this strange parade ends with a bucket of delicious slop. It does not. This, you realize with a slow, dawning sense of disbelief, is an arrest. A formal, state-sanctioned arrest of a farm animal. This pig, now officially a defendant, is being taken to the local jail. It will be held in a cell, just like a human prisoner. And, in one of the more wonderfully absurd details of this whole practice, the town is legally obligated to pay for its food and lodging for the duration. Yes, your taxes, had you been a resident of this muddy little town, would be contributing to the room and board of an accused sow. The pig will be given water and hay. It will be looked after by a jailer. And in a few days or perhaps weeks, it will be brought before a magistrate in a proper courtroom to stand trial for murder. This is the point where your 21st century brain might begin to short-circuit. It feels like a prank, an elaborate piece of street theater perhaps. But as you look at the faces of the townspeople watching from their doorways and the dead serious expressions of the officials, you understand this is no joke. This is the law. And this is where we encounter the very first question that historians still puzzle over today. What exactly did they think they were doing? When these medieval officials put an animal in the dock, were they genuinely trying the animal itself? Did they believe that this pig possessed a soul capable of sin, a mind capable of malice, and a moral compass that had gone horribly awry? Some scholars argue yes, that in their worldview, the lines were so blurred that an animal could indeed be seen as a moral agent, fully responsible for its actions. Others, however, suggest something more symbolic was at play. Perhaps trying the pig was a way to publicly condemn the act itself, a ritual to cleanse the community of a horrific event. Or maybe, just maybe, it was an indirect way of punishing the pig's owner, shaming them through their property without having to accuse a fellow human being of negligence. The debate is still very much alive in academic circles. But for you, standing there in the mud, all you know for sure is that a pig is going to jail, and its future looks incredibly bleak. To understand how a society gets to this point, you have to peel back all of your own assumptions about how the world works. You have to enter a mindset where every event, from a storm to a sputtering candle, could be a sign from God. A world where the animal and human realms were not so neatly separated. The small procession disappears around another leaning building, leaving you standing in the square. The pig's soft, questioning inks fade into the general hum of the town. People are already going back to their business. A blacksmith's hammer starts ringing again, and the smell of baking bread suddenly wafts from a nearby window. For them, what you just saw was unusual, certainly, but not reality-shattering. For you, it's a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. You're trying to fit a pig-shaped key into a human-shaped legal lock, and it just won't turn. To even begin to understand it, you have to adjust the very lens through which you see the world. Forget physics, biology, and random chance. You need to imagine a world that is drenched, absolutely saturated with meaning. Every single thing, from the grandest comet in the sky to the lowliest beetle scuttling in the dirt, exists within a vast, invisible hierarchy, a divine spreadsheet often called the Great Chain of Being. At the top, of course, is God. Below him are the angels, then humanity, then animals, then plants, and finally rocks and minerals. Everything has its place, its purpose, its role to play in a cosmic drama. A star doesn't just burn, it might be foretelling the birth of a king. A tree doesn't just grow, its wood is destined for a holy cross or a hangman's gallows. And an animal is never just an animal. So when that pig committed its crime, it wasn't simply an unfortunate, tragic accident. It was a disruption, a violation of the divinely ordained order. The pig had stepped out of its pigness and acted with a violence reserved for fallen humanity. In this worldview, that is a profoundly serious event. It's like a glitch in the matrix of creation, a crack in the cosmic wall. And when a crack appears, you don't just ignore it. You have to patch it. Becomes the theological equivalent of spackle. This is why they took portents and omens so seriously. You might see a lamb born with two heads and think, a genetic mutation. Unfortunate for the lamb, but ultimately a biological quirk. They would see it and think, this is a message. A prodigy. A sign from God that something is deeply wrong. The birth of a deformed animal could be seen as a warning of impending famine, plague, or the coming of the Antichrist. The entire community would feel a collective shudder of anxiety. It was their responsibility to interpret the sign and act accordingly, to show God they were paying attention. This is where we get one of the more peculiar niche facts of the era: the intense focus on unnatural animal behaviors. A cow that refused to give milk might not just be sick, it might be bewitched. A cat that was overly friendly to a lonely old woman might not just be a cat. It might be her demonic familiar in disguise. This brings us to another of those debates that keep medieval historians happily employed. When they held these trials, what was the primary motivation: justice or ritual? One school of thought argues that this was, in their minds, a genuine legal process. They believed the animal, as part of God's creation, was subject to God's law and therefore could be held accountable. The court case was a logical extension of that belief, a sincere attempt to mete out justice. But another, perhaps more compelling, argument is that the trials were a form of public ritual, a performance designed to restore cosmic balance. The community had been polluted by the crime, the murder, the unnatural act, and the trial was a way to ritually cleanse itself. By publicly identifying the source of the disruption, the pig, condemning it through a formal legal process, and then ceremoniously removing it from the community, often through execution, they were effectively telling God, "We have fixed the problem. We have restored order. Please don't visit your wrath upon us." In this view, the pig's actual guilt or innocence is almost irrelevant. The animal is just a prop in a large, elaborate, and deadly serious play for a divine audience. So, as you stand there, the smell of cabbage and wood smoke filling your lungs, you start to see the town differently. It's not just a collection of muddy streets and tired-looking houses. It's a stage. And every person, every animal, every gust of wind is a player. The pig isn't just a pig anymore. It's a symbol of chaos. And the trial isn't just a trial. It's an attempt to push chaos back into its box and nail the lid shut. And depending on what was being tried, and for what crime, you'd need a very specific kind of court to do the job. Your mind is still reeling from the sight of the arrested pig, but you're starting to build a fragile framework of understanding. The world is a stage, God is the audience, and bad things are cosmic disruptions. Got it. But just as you think you have a handle on the basic concept, a new layer of complexity reveals itself. It turns out not all animal trials are created equal. You couldn't just drag any old creature into any old courtroom. Oh no. This was the medieval period, after all, an era that adored bureaucracy and intricate rules, almost as much as it adored religious relics. So, you quickly learned that there were two distinct legal systems for dealing with troublesome animals, and they operated in completely different ways for completely different reasons. It was a legal fork in the road, and which path you took depended entirely on the defendant. First, you have the secular courts. These were the local, earthly courts run by lords, magistrates, and bailiffs. The same courts that tried humans for theft, assault, and murder. These courts dealt with individual animals, typically larger, domesticated ones. That pig you just saw? A classic case for the secular court. Its crime was a direct, physical harm to a human being, a clear violation of the community's laws. The defendants in these cases were almost like pigs, horses, or donkeys. Creatures that lived alongside humans were owned by them, and could, in a very tangible way, be arrested. You can't exactly put a swarm of locusts in a jail cell, after all. The process in a secular court was a startling mirror of a human trial. The animal would be arrested, imprisoned, and formally charged. There would be a judge, witnesses would be called, and evidence would be presented. And, as well see, the animal would even get a lawyer. The punishments were also human, like hanging, burning at the stake, or being buried alive. The goal here was direct, physical punishment for a specific crime. But then, on the other hand, you have the ecclesiastical courts. And this is where things, if you can believe it, get even weirder. These courts didn't deal with individual animals. They took on entire species. We're talking about rats, mice, locusts, weevils, snails, flies, any kind of pestilent creature that destroyed crops or brought disease. You can't arrest a million field mice, and you can't hang a swarm of grasshoppers. Agricultural nuisance. A sin against the community's livelihood, which was seen as a sin against God's providence. So, the church had to get creative. You'd find a community of desperate farmers, their fields being devoured by some pest. They would then go to the local sheriff. They would go to the bishop. They would file a formal legal complaint. The church court would then appoint a special prosecutor to argue the case against the pests. And in the interest of fairness, they would also appoint a lawyer to defend them. The trial would then proceed, often in absentia, since the defendants were busy eating the barley. The ultimate punishment here wasn't hanging. It was something the church believed was far more powerful, a formal curse, an anathema, or the nuclear option, excommunication. The priests would literally go to the edge of the afflicted fields and, with all the pomp and ceremony they could muster, banish the creatures from the diocese and condemn their souls to perdition. One of the funniest and most niche parts of this process was the official summons. The court couldn't proceed without formally notifying the defendants. So, a bailiff would be sent out to the fields, where he would read a legal document aloud to, say, a patch of dirt where the weevils were known to be active. Hear ye, hear ye! All weevils currently residing in this parish are hereby summoned to appear before the astical court of you. Can just imagine this poor man, standing alone in a field, yelling legal jargon at insects, probably feeling like the biggest fool in Christendom. And here again, historians are divided. On the secular side, the debate often centers on whether they truly believed the pig had moral culpability. But on the church side, the debate shifts. Were these ecclesiastical trials a genuine attempt to use divine power to solve a pest problem? Or were they a form of psychological theater for the human parishioners? Some scholars argue that the priests knew full well that reading a summons to a field of rats was absurd, but they also knew that the farmers were terrified and desperate. The trial offered them a sense of control. It was a way for the church to show it was taking their suffering seriously, to channel their anger and fear into a structured, sanctioned ritual. It gave them something to do. Instead of just watching their crops disappear, they were participating in a grand, spiritual counterattack. It was a placebo, perhaps, but a powerful one. So you now have this two-tiered system in your mind. Big animals who hurt people go to human court. Hordes of small pests who hurt crops go to church court. It's a strange and convoluted logic, but it's their logic. And with that in mind, let's return to our friend, the pig. Let's follow its journey through the secular system to a little town in Normandy, France, in the year 1386. The year is 1386. The place is Falaise, a town in Normandy, France, nestled in the shadow of a formidable stone castle, the birthplace of William the Conqueror. It's a town steeped in history and a sense of its own importance. Life here is, for the most part, predictable. The seasons turn, the market bustles, and the rhythms of work and prayer guide the days. But on one particular day, that rhythm is shattered by a scream. Let's imagine the scene. The streets are narrow and unpaved, a jumble of overhanging timber houses. Children play in the alleyways, darting between barrels and carts, their laughter echoing off the plaster walls. Among them is a very young child, maybe just an infant, left for a moment in a small enclosure or perhaps just crawling near its family's doorstep. This part of the story, like many such details from so long ago, is lost to us, sketched only by the stark legal records that survive. What we do know is this: a pig, owned by a local farmer named Prosecution D. Bailey, got loose. Pigs in the Middle Ages were not the clean, pink creatures of storybooks, kept neatly in pens. They were semi-wild, hardy scavengers, often left to roam the streets and forage for garbage. They were the town's sanitation department, in a way. But they were also large, powerful, and equipped with formidable tusks. And they were notoriously indiscriminate eaters. On this day, the free-roaming pig encounters the infant. What happens next is brutal and swift. In a horrifying act, the pig attacks the child, mauling its face and arms. The baby's cries of pain are quickly silenced. By the time help arrives, it's too late. The child is dead. The town of Falaise is plunged into a state of collective horror and outrage. This isn't a wolf attack out in the woods. This isn't a tragic illness. A creature that lives among them, turning on one of their own in the most horrific way. It's a profound violation of the natural order. A pig, a symbol of gluttony, yes, but also of sustenance and farm life, has committed the most human of sins, murder. Immediately, the gears of justice begin to turn. The pig, its snout still marked by its gruesome act, is identified. There is no question of its guilt. Multiple people witness the aftermath. The bailiff is summoned, and the animal is taken into custody. This is not just a matter of putting down a dangerous animal. That would be too simple, too quiet. The crime was public, and therefore the justice must be public. The community's sense of security has been ripped apart, and it must be stitched back together with the formal, solemn thread of the law. The pig becomes the focus of all the town's grief and anger. It's easier, in a way, to direct that rage at the grieving, likely negligent parents. It's cleaner. The pig is a simple, straightforward villain. It is identified not just as a pig, but as the pig of Prosecution D. Bailey. Its owner is shamed, his reputation tarnished by the actions of his livestock. But it is the animal itself that will bear the full weight of the law. And so, we see the first step of the process you witnessed earlier in your imagination. But this time it's real. The pig is marched to the local jail, the same place that holds human criminals, and put in a cell. This detail is recorded in the town's meticulous financial accounts, which is one of the main ways we know about these cases. The records show the expense for the pig's upkeep while it awaited trial. This was a symbolic gesture. It was a line item in the budget. Someone had to authorize the funds to buy high-end water for a killer pig. This brings us to a fashionably odd detail of medieval law, the concept of the unnatural surrender. This was an old Roman law principle that had trickled down through the centuries. It held that if your animal, or even your slave, caused harm, you had two choices. You could either pay for the damages yourself, or you could surrender the offending party, the animal or slave, to the victim's family to do with as they pleased. In a case like this, with the death of a child, financial compensation was not enough. The community demanded a more profound form of justice. So the owner, Prosecution D. Bailey, almost certainly surrendered his pig to the authorities. He washed his hands of the affair, and the pig became, in a legal sense, a being unto itself, fully responsible for its own actions. Historians still debate the true purpose of the pig's imprisonment. Was it purely practical, to keep it from causing more harm before the trial? Or was it an essential part of the legal ritual? Did the pig need to experience the deprivation of liberty, just as a human would, for the process to be seen as legitimate? Was it being punished even before the verdict was read? Some scholars argue that by treating the pig exactly like a human from the moment of arrest, the court was establishing its jurisdiction and reinforcing the idea that this was not just a pest control problem, but a genuine criminal proceeding. The cell, the food, the jailer, they were all part of the performance, demonstrating to everyone that the law of man was being applied to this beast that had so horribly broken the laws of God and nature. For the pig, of course, these legal nuances meant nothing. It was simply in a new place with stone walls instead of a muddy yard. But for the people of Falaise, every step of this process was freighted with meaning. The beast was contained. The wheels of justice were turning, and soon it would have its day in court. The days turn into weeks in the town of Falaise. For the pig, life has become a monotonous cycle of hay and water, delivered by a jailer who probably wonders what his life has come to. The cold stone of the cell is a poor substitute for the sun and mud of the farmyard. The sounds are different, to not the clucking of chickens and the lowing of cattle, but the groans of human prisoners and the distant, clanging echo of the jailer's keys. Does the pig feel a sense of foreboding? It likely just feels bored and perhaps a little confused. But outside that cell, the legal machinery is anything but bored. The Viscount of Falaise, the chief magistrate, has set a date for the trial. This is not going to be a quick, informal hearing in some dusty back room. It is scheduled to be held in the main town square, on a specially constructed scaffold, so that the entire community can bear witness. This is justice as public spectacle, a lesson for man and, supposedly, for beast. The preparations are meticulous. The court officials consult their legal texts. While there wasn't a specific chapter in the law books titled What to Do When a Pig Commits Murder, they relied on the established procedures for human capital crimes. They were determined to do this by the book to ensure the verdict was unassailable. Any procedural error could invalidate the entire ritual, leaving the town's spiritual wound unhealed. This is where you see the medieval mind's incredible capacity for what we would call cognitive dissonance. They are preparing to try an animal that cannot speak, cannot understand the charges, and has no concept of law, yet they are obsessed with ensuring it receives a fair trial according to human standards. It's like carefully building a beautiful, intricate birdcage for a fish. The craftsmanship is impressive, but the premise is fundamentally flawed. Word of the upcoming trial spreads through the surrounding countryside. On the appointed day, farmers, merchants, and artisans from miles around flock to Falaise. They leave their fields and workshops to come and see the killer pig. It's a grim form of entertainment, but also a civic duty. They come to see order restored. They pack the square, jostling for a good view of the proceedings. And so, the day arrives. The bailiff and his men go to the jail. They retrieve the pig from its cell. It has been fed and watered at the town's expense for its entire stay, a fact that the town's treasurer has dutifully noted in his ledger. This little detail of the prison bill for animals is a wonderfully mundane piece of evidence that these trials were real. In several recorded cases from the era, the cost of the animal's jail board actually exceeded the cost of its execution. They spent more to keep the animal alive for the trial than they did to kill it. The pig is led out into the daylight, perhaps blinking in the sudden brightness. It is paraded through the same streets where it once roamed freely, but this time it's not a scavenger, it's a felon. The crowd parts, and you can imagine the murmurs and pointing fingers. The families of the town pull their own children a little closer. This is the beast, the monster that stepped out of its God-given place. The pig is brought to the scaffold. The Viscount is there in his finest robes. The court clerk is ready with his quill and ink. And then comes the most surreal part of the entire process. The charges are read out in a loud, formal voice that echoes across the square. The pig is formally accused of having, in a murderous rage, mutilated and killed a young child. The pig, of course, offers no plea. It probably just sniffs at the wooden planks of the scaffold, its powerful snout twitching, perhaps looking for a dropped crumb or a stray acorn. Its silence is likely taken as an admission of guilt. How could it deny the crime? The evidence was on its very face. But the court cannot and will not proceed to a summary judgment. Even though the outcome seems inevitable, the process must be honored. And the process dictates that every defendant, no matter how vile their crime, has a right to a defense. The pig cannot speak for itself. It cannot hire a lawyer. Therefore, the court, in its wisdom and its rigid adherence to form, will appoint one for it. Here we come to one of the most hotly contested aspects of these trials among modern historians. Was the appointment of a defense lawyer a genuine attempt at justice, or was it pure window dressing? Some scholars argue it was the latter. They believe the lawyer's role was simply to make the trial look legitimate. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, and the lawyer was just another actor in the play, there to recite his lines before the inevitable final act. His presence ensured that no one could later claim the pig was denied its rights, which, as absurd as it sounds, was a real concern. However, other historians take a more charitable view. They argue that for the medieval legal mind, the principle of the right to a defense was absolute. It was a cornerstone of their developing legal systems. To deny any defendant a defense, even a pig, would be to undermine the very foundation of the law they held so dear. In this view, they weren't just going through the motions. They genuinely believed that for the verdict to be legally and spiritually valid, the case for the defense had to be made, however weakly. The lawyer wasn't there to win, he was there to make the trial whole. And so, standing there in the crowded square of Falaise, a local man of the law steps forward to take on the most unusual client of his career. Imagine being that lawyer. Let's call him Maître Thibault. One moment, you're drafting a will for a wealthy wool merchant. The next, the Viscount is clapping you on the shoulder and telling you, "Congratulations, Thibault. You're representing the pig." What do you even do with that? Your client cannot offer an alibi. It cannot name its co-conspirators. It cannot plead insanity, or remorse, or self-defense. Your entire legal training is based on language, on human motivation, and you've been assigned a client whose primary interests are rooting, snorting, and sleeping in mud. This is the absurd reality that faced the defense counsels in these animal trials. And yet, the records show they took the job seriously, or at least, they went through the motions with a commendably straight face. The lawyer for the pig of Falaise would have stood before the court, a file of notes in his hand, ready to argue on behalf of his silent, four-legged client. So what possible defense could he offer? He couldn't claim innocence. The pig was, so to speak, Cartwright snouted. The facts of the case were not in dispute. So the lawyer had to get creative, working within the bizarre logic of the system itself. His arguments would likely have fallen into a few predictable, yet fascinating categories. First, he might have tried a procedural argument. Perhaps the arrest was improper. Was the pig read its rights? A joke to us, but a procedural checkbox to them. Was the jurisdiction of this court the proper one for this specific pig? These might seem like desperate, nitpicking tactics, but they were a lawyer's bread and butter. The case could be thrown out on a technicality, regardless of the defendant's species. Second, he could have tried to argue from nature, an appeal to the pigness of the pig. He might have stood before the magistrate and argued, "Your Honor, this is a pig. It is the nature of a pig, as created by God, to be a simple beast, driven by instinct, not by malice. It knows no right or wrong. It knows only hunger. Can we truly apply human laws of murder and intent to a creature that lacks the divine spark of reason? To punish this pig as a pig is to find fault with God's own creation." This was a surprisingly common and sometimes effective line of reasoning. It was a theological tightrope walk. A third and much more cynical argument would have been to shift the blame. He couldn't blame the pig, so he would have subtly, or not so subtly, or not so subtly, gestured towards the owner, Puritet D. Bailey. Was this animal properly secured? Was it not the responsibility of its master to prevent it from roaming the streets where it could cause such harm? This was a risky move. It could anger the owner and his family, but it was a valid legal point. It reframed the event, no pig, but as a tragic failure of human responsibility. The pig was not a murderer, but a weapon, negligently wielded. One of the most curious facts about these animal lawyers is that some of them became famous for it. This wasn't a career-ending joke of an assignment. In fact, one man built his entire reputation on successfully defending the animal kingdom's most notorious pests. His name was Bartholomew Chasny, a French jurist from the 16th century, and he is a legend in the weird world of animal trials. We'll meet him properly later, but his career proves that being an animal lawyer was a legitimate, if niche, legal specialization. And here we stumble upon another of those historical debates. Were these lawyers truly trying to save the animals, or were they using these high-profile cases as a stage for their own intellectual vanity? Some historians argue that for ambitious young lawyers like Chasny, a bizarre case like this was a golden opportunity. It allowed them to show off their rhetorical flair, their mastery of obscure legal texts, and their ability to construct dazzlingly complex arguments. Winning was secondary. The real prize was impressing the powerful church and secular officials who were watching. It was a form of intellectual peacocking. The pig or the rats were just a convenient, furry springboard for their own careers. Other historians, however, suggest a more principled motivation. They argue that these lawyers saw themselves as defenders of the legal process itself. They believed that the law must be applied fairly and rigorously to all, and that included making the strongest possible defense for any client, no matter how hopeless the case. For them, defending the pig wasn't about the pig. It was about upholding the integrity of the entire legal system. If the system could convict a pig without a proper defense, then the rights of human defendants were also at risk. Back in Falaise, Maitre Thibault makes his case. We don't have a transcript of his speech, which is a great loss to history and to comedy, but we can imagine him, voice ringing with sincerity, gesturing towards his completely disinterested client, who is likely trying to eat the leg of a nearby table. He presents his arguments, weaving together theology, legal precedent, and perhaps a touch of pity. He speaks of the inscrutable will of God, the simple nature of beasts, the shared responsibility of the community. He does his job. And then he rests his case. The court has heard the arguments for the prosecution and now for the defense. It is time for the witnesses. With the defense attorney having made his case as eloquently as one can on behalf of a pig, the trial moves to its next phase, the testimony of witnesses. This is the part of the process that grounds the surreal proceedings in the grim reality of what happened. The theoretical arguments about the nature of porcini sin give way to the raw, human trauma of the event. The court clerk calls the first witness. A man shuffles forward from the crowd, his face etched with a mixture of fear and self-importance. He takes his place, swears an oath on a holy relic, perhaps a sliver of bone from a local saint, brought out for the occasion, and prepares to speak. The Viscount leans forward. The entire square falls silent, a collective holding of breath. The prosecutor begins his questioning. Can you tell the court what you saw on the day in question? The man's testimony would be simple and direct. He would recount hearing the scream, running to the scene, and seeing the pig standing over the small, lifeless body of the child. He would describe the gruesome injuries. His voice would likely shake, not just from the horror of the memory, but from the pressure of speaking in such a formal public setting. Every word he says is being recorded, becoming part of the official story. One by one, other witnesses are called. A woman who saw the pig roaming unattended earlier in the day. A neighbor who was the first to reach the child's side. Their stories corroborate each other, painting a clear and damning picture. There are no conflicting accounts, no doubts about the identity of the culprit. The pig was there. The child is gone. This is where the human drama of the event is put on full display. The trial serves as a community therapy session, a way for people to publicly voice their shock and grief. By testifying, they are not just providing evidence. They are participating in the act of restoring order. They are helping to build the legal cage that will contain the chaos that has been unleashed in their town. But there's a fascinating, unslightly strange detail about the witnesses in these trials. According to the legal conventions of the time, the pig itself was also considered a witness. Its physical state, the blood on its snout, its presence at the scene, was treated as a form of silent testimony. It was, in the eyes of the court, a witness against itself. It bore the evidence of its own crime. This brings us to a peculiar little corner of medieval law: the treatment of animal witnesses. In some cases, animals were actually called as witnesses for the prosecution or defense. There's a famous, though likely legendary, story called The Dog of Montargis, in which a dog was believed to have identified its master's killer by repeatedly attacking a specific man at court. The dog's testimony, its persistent aggression, was taken so seriously that it led to a trial by combat, where the accused man was, conveniently for the story, defeated and confessed. While this is probably a romanticized fable, it highlights a mindset where an animal's behavior could be interpreted as legally meaningful testimony. However, in our Falaise courtroom, the pig is not testifying for anyone. It's just standing there, and now the court needs to hear from its most important witnesses, the pig's fellow animals. This is not a joke. In at least one documented case, the court, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the other pigs from the same farm should be brought to the trial. The idea was to encourage them to profit by the example of their friend's punishment. And so, in a moment of pure, unadulterated historical absurdity, a small herd of pigs would have been driven into the town square to watch the proceedings. You can just picture it: a dozen pigs, utterly baffled, being prodded into a makeshift pen near the scaffold, while a man in a fancy hat sentences their former stablemate to death. It's a scene that feels like it was written by a surrealist comedian. The purpose of this, like so much else, is debated by historians. Was this a genuine belief that the other pigs could learn a moral lesson? Did they truly think that piglet number 4 would see the verdict and think, "Note to self: do not murder human infants"? The legal consequences are severe. This interpretation seems to stretch the medieval worldview to its breaking point. A more likely explanation is that this, too, was part of the public ritual, but aimed at a human audience. By bringing the other pigs to the trial, the court was sending a message to their owners. The message was, this is what happens when you fail to control your animals. Your property, your livelihood, is at risk if you are negligent. Look at this pig, and then go home and check the locks on your own pens. It transformed the individual crime of one pig into a collective warning for the entire agricultural community. The other pigs weren't the audience, they were the props, visual aids in a public service announcement about responsible livestock management. So, the human witnesses have spoken. The pig has testified in its silence, and its fellow pigs have been gathered to, presumably, take careful notes for their future conduct. The evidence is overwhelming. The case for the prosecution is complete. The defense attorney, Maitre Thibault, can offer no rebuttal. There are no surprise witnesses to call, no last-minute ends to present. All that is left is for the court to deliberate and pass its sentence. The air in the square is thick with anticipation. The fate of the pig of Falaise is about to be decided. The testimonies have concluded. A heavy silence hangs over the square in Falaise, broken only by the snuffling of the accused pig and the nervous rustling of its assembled, and likely unimpressed, Porcini jury. The Viscount, the chief magistrate, clears his throat. All eyes are on him. This is the moment of judgment, the culmination of weeks of legal procedure, community anxiety, and considerable expense for the town's jailer. The Viscount does not need to retire to a quiet chamber to deliberate. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. The facts are clear, the guilt self-evident. His role now is not so much to decide as to articulate. He must pronounce the judgment of the court in a way that satisfies the law, the church, and the grieving, angry populace. He stands, his robes giving him an air of solemn authority, and begins to speak. His voice is slow and deliberate, each word carefully chosen to carry the full weight of the law. He recounts the crime in stark detail, speaking of the innocence of the victim and the cruel and murderous nature of the act. He affirms that the trial has been conducted with all due process, that the defendant, despite being a brute beast, has been afforded the rights of defense. And then he delivers the sentence. The pig, having been found guilty of murder, is condemned to be executed. But it will not be a simple, quick death. The punishment must fit the crime, and in the medieval world, that meant a grim and symbolic symmetry. The pig had mutilated the child's face and arms. Therefore, the pig must suffer the same. The sentence dictates that the pig will first be taken to the public square, and there it will be maimed in its head and its foreloes, mirroring the injuries it inflicted. Only after this initial act of retributive justice will it be hanged by its hind legs from a gibbet until it is dead. It's a brutal, visceral sentence, designed to be as shocking as the crime itself. This is not about humane euthanasia for a dangerous animal. This is about vengeance. It is about lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, or in this case, a mangled limb for a mangled limb. And then comes the final, and perhaps most surreal part of the sentence. To complete the parallel with a human criminal, the pig is to be dressed up. The court orders that the pig be fitted with human clothing for its execution. Specifically, it is to wear a man's waistcoat, gloves on its foretrotters, and breeches on its hind legs. This detail, which is documented in the actual court records, is so bizarre it feels like a fever dream. Why dress a pig in human clothes before hanging it? This is one of the little details that sends historians into a frenzy of interpretation. There's no single, easy answer. One theory is that it was an act of ultimate humiliation. By forcing the animal into a grotesque parody of a human crime, it was a way of saying you tried to act like a man, so we will kill you like a man, but we will make it clear that you are nothing but a beast in a cheap costume. Another, more complex theory is that it was necessary to complete the legal symbolism. The pig was tried in a human court under human laws. Therefore, it had to be executed as a human person. The clothes were the final piece of the legal puzzle, transforming the animal, for the purposes of the ritual, into a condemned man. It blurred the line between animal and human one last time, in order to make the human style execution legally and symbolically coherent. This brings us to a wonderfully odd bit of historical trivia: the executioner's bill. Just like a jailer, the executioner had to be paid for his services. And in the surviving financial records of these trials, you can find the detailed invoices. The bill for the Falaise execution is a masterpiece of macabre bureaucracy. It lists the cost for the new waistcoat, breeches, and gloves for the pig. It lists the fee for the man who dragged the pig to the gallows. It lists the executioner's own fee for carrying out the sentence. Justice, it turns out, especially strange porcini justice, was not cheap. The sentence has been passed. The crowd murmurs its approval. This feels right to them. It feels just. The ritual is nearing its completion. The men-at-arms move forward to take the condemned pig into their custody. The defense attorney, Maitre Thibault, has done his job. His responsibility is over. He can now go back to his office, perhaps pouring himself a very large glass of wine and wondering, not for the first career choices. The pig is led away, its fate sealed. The story of the pig of Falaise, with its grim and theatrical end, is the quintessential example of a secular animal trial. It's a story of an individual animal, a direct crime, and a physical, retributive punishment. But as we leave the blood-soaked square of Falaise, our journey into this strange legal world is far from over, because for every pig that was hanged, there were thousands, perhaps millions, of much smaller criminals who were not being taken to the gallows, but to a different court entirely. We leave behind the grim, theatrical square of Falaise, the image of a pig in a waistcoat fading from our minds. The air there smelled of blood and a particular kind of brutal, earthly justice. But now we're going to shift our focus. We're moving away from the secular courts with their hangmen and their physical punishments, and wading into the even stranger waters of the ecclesiastical courts. Here, the defendants, but not individual animals, but entire populations, but something far more insidious: economic devastation. Imagine you are no longer a town dweller, but a peasant farmer. Your entire existence is dictated by the sun, the rain, and the success of your crops. Your life is a constant battle against forces you cannot control. A drought can starve your family. A flood can wipe away a year's worth of work in a single afternoon. And then there are the pests. You've spent weeks plowing your small strip of land, carefully sowing your precious barley seeds. You've watched the green shoots emerge, a fragile promise of bread for the winter. And then, one morning, you walk out to your field and find it moving. A shimmering, crawling carpet of insects, weevils perhaps, or locusts, is devouring everything. Or maybe it's not insects. Maybe you open your grain store and find it infested with rats and mice, their droppings contaminating what their teeth don't destroy. What do? This isn't one pig you can capture and kill. This is an army. A relentless, swarming tide of tiny monsters eating away your future. Your anger and despair are immense, and in a world saturated with meaning, you don't just see this as bad luck. You see it as a punishment, a curse, a sign of God's displeasure. The devil, you might whisper, is at work in your fields. So, you don't go to the local magistrate. What's he going to do, arrest a million weevils? No, you go to the true power in the land, the institution that deals with curses and divine displeasure. You go to the church. You and your fellow farmers would draft a formal petition to the local bishop. This wasn't just a panicked plea for prayers. It was a legal document. It would formally state the grievance that a plague of rats or a scourge of flies had infested the parish, causing undue hardship and threatening the livelihood of good, God-fearing folk. You were, in essence, suing the vermin. The bishop, taking the matter seriously, would initiate a case in his ecclesiastical court. This court's power didn't come from swords and guards, but from the authority of God. Its weapons were words, rituals, and the terrifying threat of eternal damnation. The first step was to gather information. The court would appoint investigators, usually a couple of priests, to go and inspect the damage. They would visit the afflicted fields, take note of the destruction, and perhaps even try to interview the pests. This is a wonderfully ridiculous image to solemn priests, standing in a field of half-eaten cabbages, trying to discern the motivations of a swarm of caterpillars. They would then write up a formal report confirming that, yes, the parish was indeed overrun with a destructive multitude of crawling things. This leads to a little-known fact about these proceedings, the concept of admonition. Before the trial could begin, the court was usually required to issue a series of warnings. It was seen as the merciful Christian thing to do, so a priest would be dispatched to the infested areas to perform a first admonition. He would stand there, perhaps with a cross and some holy water, and address the pests directly. He would exhort them to cease their destructive behavior and leave the parish within a set number of days. "Oh, ye violent unclean creatures, I command thee to depart from these fields untrouble the good people no more." When the rats or weevils inevitably failed to comply, their tiny ears apparently deaf to the priest's holy commands, he would return a few days later to issue a second, sterner warning. And then, a third and final one. Only after these three admonitions had been ignored could the formal legal proceedings begin. The historical debate around these church trials is fascinating. Did the priests and bishops actually believe they could command an army of insects to leave? For some, the answer is probably yes. They lived in a world of miracles and demonic influence, and a priest's holy words were seen as a genuine weapon. They were engaging in a form of spiritual pest control. However, many historians argue for a more psychological interpretation. They suggest the church knew these rituals were unlikely to work in a literal sense. The real purpose was to manage the human population. The trial was a way of giving the desperate farmers a sense of agency. It provided a structure for their fear and a focus for their anger. The slow, methodical process, the petition, the investigation, the repeated admonitions, was a form of community counseling. The most powerful institution in their lives was taking their problems seriously. It was a way of saying, "We are in this together. We will fight this scourge with the most powerful tools we have," even if those tools were just words shouted at a swarm of bugs. The ritual itself was the solution, not the verdict. The court has received the petition. The investigation is complete. The warnings have been issued and ignored. The stage is now set for a trial. The prosecution will argue that these creatures are agents of Satan. The defense, incredibly, will argue that they are just hungry. And at the heart of one of the most famous of these cases is a lawyer who would become a legend for his brilliant and utterly absurd defense of a town besieged by rats. The year is now sometime in the early 16th century, a little later than our pig trial, but the same buzz our legal framework is still firmly in place. We find ourselves in the French town of Autun. It's a handsome place, known for its ancient Roman ruins and its magnificent cathedral. But at this moment, the citizens of Autun are not admiring their architecture. They are in a state of panic. The town and the surrounding farmlands have been completely overrun by rats. Not just a few rats, but a biblical scale infestation. They are devouring the grain, destroying the harvests, and spreading fear throughout the community. The people have done everything they could. They've set traps, they've brought in cats, but the tide of rats is relentless. Having exhausted all practical options, they turn to the spiritual. They file their formal complaint with the ecclesiastical court, and the legal process against the entire rat population of Autun begins. The usual steps are taken. The priests go out and issue their solemn warnings, which are, of course, ignored by the defendants, who are busy chewing through sacks of barley. The court is ready to proceed to a summary judgment and pronounce a curse of excommunication upon the furry little criminals. But then, something unexpected happens. The court, in its adherence to proper legal form, appoints a defense counsel for the rats. They need a lawyer to represent the accused, and the man they choose for this seemingly thankless task is a brilliant young jurist named Bartholomew Chasney. This is the man we heard about earlier, the future star of the animal bar. At this point in his career, H.E.S., an ambitious young lawyer eager to make a name for himself. And this case, as absurd as it seems, is his golden opportunity. Chasney does not see this as a joke. He sees it as a complex legal problem, and he dives into it with the full force of his considerable intellect. He will not let his clients be condemned without a fight. Bartholomew Chasney would go on to become a very prominent, unrespected judge, and he would later write a massive legal treatise called Concilium Primum, in which he collected and analyzed all the existing laws and precedents concerning animal trials. This book is one of the single most important sources we have for understanding this practice. It's a serious, scholarly work that treats the subject with complete legal gravity. So when he took on the case of the Autun rats, he was not just winging it. He was, in fact, laying the groundwork for becoming the world's foremost expert on the topic. His first move is a brilliant piece of legal maneuvering. The rats have been summoned to appear in court on a specific day to answer the charges against them. Naturally, the day comes and goes, and the courtroom remains conspicuously empty of rodents. The prosecutor immediately stands up and demands a default judgment. The defendants have failed to appear, he argues, so they have forfeited their right to a defense and should be condemned immediately. This is where Chasney stands up to make his first argument, and it's a showstopper. He argues that the summons was invalid. Why? Because it was a general summons, addressed to all the rats of Autun. He argues that this is unfair. My clients, he would have said, his face a mask of legal sincerity, are a dispersed and disparate population. They live in many different villages and hamlets throughout the diocese. A single summons is not sufficient. Each community, each individual rat, must be served with its own personal summons, read aloud in its specific location to ensure that every single defendant is aware of the charges. He argues that his clients are busy parents. Many of them are responsible for raising their young, and it is unreasonable to expect them to abandon their families to attend court. He paints a picture of a hard-working, family-oriented rat society now being unjustly harassed by the court. The judges, likely stunned by the audacity of this argument but unable to find a flaw in its legal logic, have to agree. The case is postponed to give the court officials time to go out and issue the summons to every known rat hole in the district. This brings up a delightful niche detail: the sheer logistical absurdity these trials could generate. We have to imagine the bailiffs of Auten fanning out across the countryside for weeks on end, scrolls in hand, stopping at every barn, every ditch, and solemnly reading a legal document to a hole in the wall. Hear ye, rat residing at number 3, dung heap, Farmer Du Bois's East Field. It's a level of bureaucratic dedication that is both maddening and deeply impressive. And of course, this tactic raises another one of those historical debates. What was Chastney really doing here? Was he genuinely trying to save the rats? Probably not. Was he a secret rationalist, using the law to subtly mock the entire process and show how ridiculous it was? This is a popular theory. By taking the legal principles to their most absurd logical conclusions, he was perhaps holding up a mirror to the court, forcing them to see the folly of it all. He wasn't breaking the rules, he was following them so perfectly that the whole system started to look ridiculous. Another theory, however, is that he was simply being a good lawyer, and a very ambitious one. His goal wasn't to save the rats or to mock the court. His goal was to showcase his own genius. He was demonstrating his unparalleled command of legal procedure, his ability to craft an argument from nothing, his silver-tongued rhetoric. The rats were not his clients, they were his props. The courtroom was his stage, and he was putting on the performance of a lifetime for an audience of powerful bishops and lords who were the key to his future career. Whatever his motivation, Chastney had won the first round. The case was delayed, and he had bought some time to prepare his next, even more ingenious, defense. The bailiffs of Auten have completed their ridiculous, government-mandated tour of every rat hole in the district. The summons has been reissued 1,000 times over. A new court date is set, and once again the day arrives, and the courtroom is filled with robed clerics, anxious farmers, and one very confident lawyer, but not a single rat. They have, for a second time, failed to appear. The prosecutor, surely exasperated by now, stands up again. "Your Excellency," he says to the bishop, "the defendants have been properly summoned, according to the defense counsel's own exacting standards. They have once again thumbed their noses at this sacred court. There can be no more excuses. We demand judgment. It seems like an open and shut case. Chastney's procedural tricks have run their course. The rats are guilty, on top of all their other crimes. But Bartholomew Chastney is just getting started." He rises to his feet, calm and collected, and apologizes to the court on behalf of his clients. "They desperately wanted to come," he explains, "but they were unable to. The journey was simply too perilous." He begins to paint a vivid picture for the judges. "My clients," he argues, "are a timid and vulnerable people. They were fully prepared to obey the court's summons and make the journey to Auten to answer these charges. However, they were faced with a grave and deadly threat." He pauses for dramatic effect. "I speak, of course, of the town's cats." You can almost hear the collective blink of the entire courtroom. Chastney goes on to explain in meticulous legal detail that the plaintiffs, the citizens of Auten, own a great number of mortal enemies of his clients. These cats, he argues, are lurking in every alleyway, on every rooftop, waiting to ambush any law-abiding rat who might attempt to make its way to the courthouse, to compel his clients to appear in court, knowing they would have to run this feline gauntlet, would be to sentence them to certain death before they even had a chance to defend themselves. It would be a violation of their fundamental right to a safe passage to and from the court. Therefore, he makes a formal legal demand. Before his clients can be expected to appear, the court must issue an injunction against all the cat owners of Auden. They must be legally bound to lock up their cats, to post a bond guaranteeing the good behavior of their pets, and to ensure that the roads leading to the courthouse are completely free of any and all feline predators, until such a time as the safety of his clients can be absolutely guaranteed. He argues their failure to appear is not a sign of contempt, but an entirely reasonable act of self-preservation. This is the genius of Bartholomew Chesney. He is not arguing outside the law. He is using the law's own principles against itself. The right to safe passage for defendants was a real and important legal concept. Chesney simply applies it to a non-human client. He has once again trapped the court in its own logic. The judges cannot deny that the cats pose a threat to the rats, and they cannot deny that defendants have a right to be protected. To do so would be to create a dangerous precedent for human trials. This specific argument, the fear of cats' defense, is what cemented Chesney's reputation. It is a masterclass in creative legal thinking. It is logical, it is based on precedent, and it is completely, utterly, breathtakingly absurd. This leads us to a strange but true tidbit of legal history from the time the idea of legal impediments. Courts recognized that there were legitimate reasons why a person might not be able to appear when summoned. Illness, a flood that washed out a bridge, or being captured by bandits were all considered valid excuses. Chesney was essentially trying to have being eaten by a cat officially recognized as a legitimate legal impediment. He was attempting to write a new, species-specific clause into the unwritten rules of contempt of court. The debate among historians about Chesney's motives burns brightest right here. The subversive mockery camp sees this as the ultimate proof. He has made the court officials openly discuss the legal ramifications of the predator-prey relationship between cats and rats. He has forced them to contemplate issuing a restraining order against an entire city's worth of cats. He has pushed the proceedings so far into the realm of the ridiculous that he must be doing it intentionally to expose the foolishness of the whole endeavor. But the ambitious lawyer camp has a strong counter-argument. They say we are projecting our modern rationalism onto him. In his world, if a court can try a rat, why can't it also restrain a cat? For Chesney, this might have been a perfectly logical, if challenging, legal puzzle. He saw a loophole, a weakness in the prosecution's case, and he exploited it with the tools he had. His goal wasn't to tear down the system. It was to win within it, and he was playing it better than anyone else. The court is now in a bind. The plaintiffs, the townspeople, refuse to lock up their cats. They argue that it's their right to have cats to protect their homes from, well, the rats. They are effectively refusing to comply with the conditions required to bring the defendants to trial. The case grinds to a halt. Chesney has created a perfect, paradoxical legal checkmate. The trial cannot proceed, and his clients, the rats of Auden, get away with it. They have won by default. And Bartholomew Chesney becomes a legal superstar. Bartholomew Chesney's brilliant, cat-based legal gambit leaves the court of Auden in a state of suspended animation. The case is stalled, a monument to procedural absurdity. But the problem that Chesney so cleverly exploited, the difficulty of getting the defendants into the courtroom, was a constant headache for the ecclesiastical courts. The trial of the rats of Auden is the most famous example, but nearly every case against pest faced this same fundamental, comical hurdle. How do you serve a legal summons on a defendant who cannot read? cannot understand, and is currently busy eating your prize-winning turnips. This logistical nightmare forced the courts to develop a whole system of procedures that seem almost surreal to us today. We've already seen the first step, the bailiff shouting at a field. But it was often more complex than that. The court had to prove it had made a good faith effort. So, the summoner, often a priest or a minor court official, would not only read the summons aloud, but he would also nail a physical copy of the document to a tree or a post in the afflicted field. For pests infesting a vineyard, the summons would be attached to the vines themselves. This was meant to be the insect equivalent of taping an eviction notice to someone's front door. The assumption, at least on paper, was that the defendants would see the notice, gather their tiny belongings, and respectfully depart the premises as ordered. Then there was the problem of representation. The court had not an appointed chastenee. This was common practice. The court felt that for a trial to be valid, both sides had to be argued. But what if the defendants, for some reason, couldn't secure legal counsel? There's one recorded case involving a plague of Spanish flies where the court determined that the flies were too frivolous and small to be able to afford a lawyer. So, in an act of legal charity, the court appointed a lawyer for them and ordered the town to pay his fees. The citizens who were being ruined by the flies had to pay for the flies' legal defense. You can imagine how well that went over at the next town meeting. This entire process of summoning unrepresentation highlights a key theological and legal principle of the time, the idea that justice must be available to all of God's creatures. This is a genuinely bizarre but important concept. They believed that since God created the flies, the rats, and the weevils, they must have some basic rights. One of those rights was the right to exist and to eat. A common defense argument, used when the fear of cats' defense wasn't available, was that the animals were simply exercising their God-given right to sustenance. The lawyer would argue that God made these creatures, and he must have intended for them to eat something. Therefore, to condemn them for eating was to question God's divine plan. This is a beautiful example of a niche historical fact, the right to forage argument. Defense lawyers for pests would often concede that their clients were causing damage, but they would argue that it was not malicious. They were simply creatures of God, taking the small share that nature had allotted to them. Some lawyers would even propose a compromise. In one case against weevils, the defense attorney offered, on behalf of his clients, to vacate the plaintiff's fields if the town would agree to set aside a different, equally fertile plot of land for the weevils' exclusive use. The court actually considered this offer, debating the quality of the soil and water sources on the proposed weevil reservation before the deal ultimately fell through. This is where the debate among historians gets particularly interesting. Are we looking at a legal system that genuinely believed in the abstract rights of insects? Or is this all an elaborate way of managing human expectations? The psychological theater school of thought argues that these procedures were not for the animals at all. They were for the farmers. When a farmer sees the priest nailing a notice to a vine, and then later hears that the weevils have been given a lawyer and are being offered a new field, it creates the impression of a powerful, just, and even merciful system at work. It assures him that his grievance is being handled by a process that is fair to all parties, even the ones currently devouring his livelihood. It replaces his feeling of helpless rage with a sense of participating in a grand, orderly, and deeply meaningful legal drama. The problem of the summons, therefore, wasn't really a problem. It was a feature. The delays, the absurd procedural arguments, the multiple warnings, they all served to stretch out the process. This gave the community time to calm down. It gave nature time to take its course. Perhaps the pest population would decline on its own. And it gave the church an opportunity to display its power and wisdom over a period of weeks or months. The summons wasn't about getting the rats into court. It was about reinforcing the court's authority in the minds of the people. And if, after all these efforts, the pests still refused to show up and stubbornly continued their destruction, the court had one final, terrifying weapon in its arsenal. So the summons has been nailed to trees, and the defense attorney has exhausted all of his brilliant, time-wasting maneuvers. The defendants, be they rats, flies, or the dreaded weevil, have stubbornly refused to appear in court. They have ignored the admonitions. They have rejected the kind offer of a new field to call their own. They have, in the eyes of the ecclesiastical court, demonstrated a pattern of stubborn and unrepentant criminality. What happens now? The court has run out of procedural carrots. It's time for the stick, and in the world of the church court, the biggest, most powerful stick was the threat of anathema and excommunication. This was the nuclear option. For a human, excommunication was the most terrifying fate imaginable. It meant being cut off from the church, denied the sacraments, and most horrifilously, being barred from entering heaven. It was spiritual death. The church, logically, extended this same punishment to the animal kingdom. If a population of pests was found guilty in absentia, the bishop would pronounce a formal curse upon them. This wasn't just a priest muttering angrily in a field. It was a full-blown ceremony, performed with the utmost gravity and theatrical flair. It was known as the major excommunication, reserved for the most serious offenses. The bishop, accompanied by other priests, would proceed to the edge of the town or to the afflicted fields. He would be dressed in his most solemn vestments, often purple, the color of mourning and penance. He would carry a bell, a book, and a candle. The ceremony would begin with the ringing of the bell. This wasn't a cheerful peal, it was a harsh, dissonant clanging meant to signal a death. Then, the bishop would open the book and read the formal sentence of anathema. The language was powerful and terrifying. He would invoke the names of God, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints, and by their authority, he would curse the offending creatures. He would condemn them in all their parts, their heads, their eyes, their mouths, their limbs. He would curse them whether they were in the field or in the forest, in the water or on the land. He would command them to depart from the parish and go to a place where they could harm no one. And he would condemn their souls, for it was believed even insects had a sort of life for soul to damnation. Then came the dramatic climax. As he finished the final words of the curse, the bishop would slam the book shut, symbolizing the closing of heaven's gates. He would then lift the lit candle and, as he pronounced the final word of the sentence, snuff it out and cast it to the ground. This powerful piece of symbolism represented the extinguishing of the creatures' souls from the light of God's grace. The light of their very existence had been put out. They were now officially damned. One of the most wonderfully specific details about this process is the destination of the curse. The church couldn't just curse the animals to go away. That was too vague. They often had to specify a location for the pests to relocate to. This led to some interesting ecological and legal problems. In one case, a court banished a plague of caterpillars to a nearby patch of wilderness. The defense lawyer immediately objected, arguing that the designated area was already inhabited by other creatures who had a prior claim to the land and would be unfairly inconvenienced by the sudden arrival of thousands of cursed caterpillars. The court had to reconsider the destination. They were, in effect, debating zoning laws for the damned. And here we find another classic historical debate. Did they really believe this worked? Did the bishop, after snuffing out his candle, expect to return the next day and find the fields miraculously clear of weevils? Some conservative religious scholars and historians have argued yes. They believe that in an age of faith, this was seen as a genuine invocation of divine power. They were performing a kind of holy exorcism on the landscape, and they had faith that a just God would answer their plea and smite the offending creatures. However, most historians lean towards a more skeptical and psychological interpretation. They argue that the excommunication ceremony was the final act of the community's therapeutic drama. It was not intended to solve the pest problem, but to solve the human problem of despair and anger. The ceremony provided a powerful, emotional, and satisfying conclusion. It was a moment of catharsis. The community had identified the enemy, fought it through the legal system, and now finally had witnessed its ultimate spiritual destruction. They had done everything they could. The matter was now literally in God's hands. This also served to protect the reputation of the church. If the pests disappeared after the ceremony, it was hailed as a miracle, proof of the church's power. And if the pests didn't disappear, well, that wasn't the church's fault. It was a sign that the community's own sins were so great that they had nullified the curse. The failure of the excommunication was turned back on the people, becoming a reason for them to pray harder, be more pious, and, of course, donate more generously to the church. It was a system that was, in its own way, foolproof. The church could not lose. But the pig who was hanged and the rats who were cursed were not the only kinds of animals to face the law. Sometimes the crime wasn't murder or crop destruction. Sometimes it was something far stranger. We've seen the court of man with its hangman and its waistcoats for pigs. We've seen the court of God with its curses and its legal debates about caterpillar real estate. Now we travel to the city of Basel, Switzerland in the year 1474, for a case that sits at the bizarre intersection of both. The crime is not murder. It is not theft. It is something so strange, so profoundly unnatural in the medieval worldview, that it was seen as a direct sign of demonic influence. A rooster laid an egg. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer, beautiful absurdity of that sentence. In a quiet courtyard in Basel, a local resident discovers that his cockerel, a creature that by all the laws of God and nature should be incapable of such a thing, has produced a small, misshapen egg. To our modern, scientific minds, this is a biological anomaly. We might guess it was a hen that was misidentified as a rooster, or perhaps a case of a rare physiological abnormality. We would be curious, maybe call the local university's biology department. The people of 15th century Basel did not call the university. They called the magistrate. Because for them, a rooster laying an egg was not a biological curiosity. It was a curiosity. This taps into a deep vein of ancient folklore. The egg of a rooster, often called a cockatrice egg, was believed to be an object of immense dark power. According to legend, if such an egg were to be hatched, and it could only be hatched by a toad or a serpent, it would bring forth a cockatrice or a basilisk. This was a mythical beast of incredible evil, a creature with the head of a rooster, and its gaze was said to be instantly fatal, its breath poisonous, and its very existence an affront to God. So, when this poor, confused rooster produced its little egg, the citizens of Basel didn't see an omelet. They saw the potential for an apocalypse-level monster. They saw a satanic plot unfolding in their very own city. The rooster was not just an anomaly, it was an agent of the devil, attempting to unleash a terrible evil upon the world. The reaction was swift and serious. The rooster was immediately arrested. The egg was carefully confiscated as evidence, and a full-blown secular trial was convened. This wasn't a case for the church courts, because while the crime was supernatural in nature, the potential consequence of rampaging basilisk was a direct threat to the lives and safety of the citizens. This was a matter of public security. The rooster was put in a cage, brought before a panel of grim-faced judges, and formally charged with the heinous and unnatural crime of laying an egg. And, in keeping with the traditions we've already seen, the rooster was assigned a lawyer to defend its case. Imagine being that lawyer. The pig lawyer in Falaise at least had a tangible crime to deal with. The rooster lawyer in Basel had to defend his client against a charge rooted in pure mythology. His arguments must have been a masterclass in theological and legal acrobatics. He likely argued, much like the pig's lawyer, that his client was a simple beast, acting on instinct. "My client is a rooster," he might have said. "It knows only how to strut and crow. It has no understanding of the demonic properties of its own biological functions. It cannot be held responsible for the folkloric interpretations." He might have even tried to argue that the event was a miracle, not a demonic plot assigned from God whose meaning was simply misunderstood. He did his best, but the prosecution's case was too strong, fueled by centuries of fear and superstition. The prosecutor would have paraded the small, strange egg before the court. He would have quoted from ancient bestiaries and theological texts about the horrors of the basilisk. He would have painted a terrifying picture of what would happen if the court showed leniency. The city of Basel itself was at stake. The court, unsurprisingly, found the rooster guilty. The verdict was swift and decisive. The rooster, as an agent of Satan, must be destroyed with it. The sentence was death by burning. This was a punishment usually reserved for the most vile of human criminals, heretics, and witches. By sentencing the rooster to be burned at the stake, the court was officially classifying its crime as an act of heresy, a direct collaboration with the forces of darkness. And so we have the incredible, documented spectacle of the public execution of a chicken for a supernatural crime. A stake was erected in the town square. A crowd gathered to watch the sentence being carried out. The rooster, along with its infamous egg, was brought to the executioner, tied the bird to the stake. The fire was lit, and the citizens of Basel watched as the agent of Satan was consumed by flames, thus saving their city from the theoretical threat of a monster. This case is debated fiercely by historians. Was this a moment of genuine mass hysteria, a community so gripped by fear that they truly believed a rooster was a diabolical conspirator? Or was it something more cynical? Some scholars suggest the trial may have had a hidden human target. Perhaps the rooster's owner was an unpopular figure in the town. By trying and condemning his rooster for witchcraft, the community might have been indirectly accusing the owner of being a warlock, without having to make a direct and dangerous accusation against a fellow citizen. The rooster became a proxy for a human conflict. This strange case shows how the line between secular and ecclesiastical concerns could blur. The crime was a violation of the laws of nature, God's law, but the punishment was carried out by the secular state to protect its citizens. It's a perfect fusion of superstitious terror and bureaucratic procedure, and it reminds us that not all animal trials were about grand ideas of justice or community. Sometimes they were just about being deeply afraid of what might hatch from a weird-looking egg. The smoke has cleared in the town square of Basel, and the citizens can sleep soundly, safe from the theoretical threat of a basilisk. The rooster's fate was extreme, a capital punishment for a supernatural crime. But not every animal that found itself on the wrong side of the law faced such a grim and fiery end. Justice, even for animals, could sometimes be tempered with a strange kind of mercy, or at least a less terminal form of punishment. Sometimes the crime wasn't serious enough to warrant death. The animal had transgressed, yes, but its sin was more of an annoyance than a mortal threat. In these cases, the courts would turn to a different kind of punishment, one that focused not on ending the animal's life, but on shaming it. The goal was public humiliation. Let's step away from the high drama of murder and witchcraft and consider a more mundane, but equally real case. Imagine a donkey, a stubborn, noisy, and ill-tempered donkey owned by a local baker. This donkey has a habit of getting loose and causing minor chaos. It eats flowers from people's window boxes. It knocks over barrels. And most annoyingly, it brays loudly and at all hours of the night, right under the window of a light sleeping town official. The official, fed up, decides to take legal action. The donkey is formally charged with disturbing the peace and being a public nuisance. A trial is held. The evidence is presented. Disgruntled neighbors testify to sleepless nights. A gardener tearfully recounts the loss of his prized petunias. The donkey's lawyer, because of course it has a lawyer, argues that his client is simply expressing its natural donkeyness, and that its braying is not a malicious act, but a song of longing for its distant desert ancestors. The court is unmoved. The donkey is found guilty. But executing a donkey for being annoying seems a bit much, even for a medieval court. It would also deprive the baker of his valuable property. So the court opts for a different sentence. The donkey is condemned to be placed in the stocks. The stocks, or the pillory, were a classic form of human punishment, designed for maximum public embarrassment. They were a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, located in the most prominent part of the town square. A person sentenced to the stocks would be locked in for a set number of hours, or even days, exposed to the scorn and ridicule of the entire community. Passers-by would mock them, and often pelt them with garbage, mud, and rotting vegetables. It was a miserable and deeply humiliating experience. And now imagine this punishment applied to a donkey. The convicted animal is led to the square. It is somehow wrestled into the wooden frame, its large, furry head and perhaps its forelows locked into the holes. And there it stands, for a full day, a spectacle of shame. The townspeople would gather to laugh at the ridiculous sight of a donkey in the stocks. Children would point. The official whose sleep had been disturbed could look out his window with a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. One of the most curious details about these lesser punishments is the idea of imprisonment as sentence. While the pig of Falaise was imprisoned before its trial, some animals were sentenced to jail time as their punishment. There are records of horses sentenced to a month of confinement for kicking their owners. The idea of a horse serving time is wonderfully absurd. Did the horse learn its lesson during its 4 weeks of incarceration? Did it have time to reflect on its crimes and emerge a reformed member of equine society? Historians are still debating whether the point of this was to punish the animal or to punish the owner by depriving him of the use of his animal for a month. It was, in effect, a temporary confiscation of property framed in the language of criminal justice. This whole category of non-lethal punishments raises a fascinating question for historians. Were these sentences a sign that the legal system was becoming more humane and nuanced, or were they just more practical? The humane argument suggests that these courts were capable of proportionality. They recognized that not all crimes were equal. They could distinguish between the demonic evil of a rooster laying an egg and the petty annoyance of a noisy donkey. This shows a level of legal sophistication They were creating a tiered system of justice for animals, with a spectrum of punishments to match a spectrum of crime. The more cynical practical argument, however, points to economics. Executing a pig is one thing, but executing a valuable horse or an ox was a significant financial blow, not just to the owner, but to the community that relied on that animal for transport or farm labor. Shaming the animal in the stocks, or jailing it for a few weeks, achieved the goal of public condemnation, unnatural cleansing without destroying a valuable economic asset. The punishment was designed to be symbolic, not economically ruinous. It was a slap on the wrist, or in this case, a rotten tomato to the furry head. So while the most famous cases are the ones that end at the gallows or the stake, it's important to remember this other side of animal justice. It was a world where a grumpy donkey could get a criminal record. It reminds us that the system was not just a blunt instrument of death. It was a complex, flexible, and often deeply weird tool for managing the chaotic and sometimes hilarious relationship between humans and the animals they lived with. And it wasn't just the large, noisy animals that found themselves in trouble. Sometimes the law had to deal with the very smallest of criminals. We've seen the law grapple with the crimes of large, powerful beasts and the quiet, supernatural threat of a rooster. We've seen it scold a donkey and excommunicate an army of rats. But the reach of medieval justice was truly all-encompassing. No creature was too big, and it turns out no creature was too small. The legal system, in its majestic and obsessive quest for order, would even put snails on trial. Let's journey to the town of Macon, France, in the year 1487. The region is known for its vineyards, the pride of the local economy. But the precious grapevines are under attack, not by rats or locusts, but by a slow-moving, shell-backed army of snails. They are methodically chewing their way through the tender leaves and shoots, threatening the future wine harvest. The vintners are desperate. They file their complaint with the ecclesiastical court. And so begins the legal case of the people v. the snails of Macon. The process unfolds with the same solemn formality we've come to expect. A delegation of priests is sent to the vineyards to observe the criminal activity of the mollusks. They issue the three requisite admonitions, commanding the snails, in God's name, to desist and depart. The snails, moving at their own glacial pace, pay no heed. A trial is convened. A prosecutor is appointed to argue against the snails, and a defense lawyer is appointed to speak on their behalf. The prosecutor would have argued that the snails, by destroying the vines, were not just harming the vintner's income, they were attacking a plant that held deep religious significance. Wine was central to the Christian Eucharist, a symbol of Christ's blood. Therefore, the snail's actions were a form of sacrilege. They were, quite literally, eating the body and blood of Christ in its rawest, most vegetative form. The defense attorney, in turn, would have mounted the now familiar right to forage defense. He would argue that his silent, slimy clients were merely partaking of the sustenance that God had provided for all his creatures, who were mortals to say that a grape leaf belonged more to a man than to a snail. The court, after hearing the arguments, finds the snails guilty. But the sentence is where the story takes a fascinating turn. The court doesn't just curse them. It issues a formal, legal order of banishment. The snails are commanded to remove themselves from the vineyards of Macon and gather in a specific, designated area outside the town. This was the snail reservation we touched on earlier, a real-life example of the court attempting to broker and deal with a population of invertebrates. This tiny, Historical detail about the legal proceedings against snails and other small pests, like weevils or caterpillars, is wonderfully revealing. It shows the medieval legal mind trying to apply principles of property law and territorial rights to the natural world. They were reading the snails not just as criminals, but as a rival nation, a group of illegal squatters who needed to be formally unlegally evicted. Of course, the story has a comical postscript. The snails did not obey the court order. They continued to munch on the grapevines. The court, seeing its authority flouted, issued a final decree of excommunication. They were cursed and damned for their contempt of court. Whether this had any more effect than the original banishment order is, as you might guess, not recorded. The sheer range of creatures prosecuted is staggering. It wasn't just pigs, rats, and roosters. The legal record is filled with cases against a veritable zoo of defendants. Moles were put on trial for damaging fields. Dolphins were prosecuted in the port of Marseilles for disrupting shipping lanes. Termites, ants, and even eels have all had their day in court. Each case followed the same basic, surreal formula, a human-like legal process applied to an non-human defendant. This brings us to a historical debate that swirls around all these cases, from the pig to the snail. Were they really trying the animal? Or was the animal justice stand in for something else? One compelling theory is that these trials were a form of surrogate justice. In many cases, the real culprit was a force of nature that humans couldn't control. If a river flooded and destroyed a village, you couldn't put the river on trial. But if a swarm of locusts carried in by a storm ate your crops, you could put the locusts on trial. The locusts became a tangible, prosecutable stand-in for the intangible, unstoppable force of the storm. The trial was a way of imposing a human, legal order onto the chaos of the natural world. It allowed people to feel a sense of control in the face of overwhelming and random disaster. Another related theory is that these trials were a way to find a scapegoat without blaming God. If your harvest failed, it was easy to think that God was punishing you for your sins. But this was a terrifying, undemoralizing thought. It was much more comforting to believe that the disaster was caused by a band of criminal weevils who were agents of the devil. By prosecuting the weevils, you could fight back against the evil without questioning God's love or justice. The weevils were a convenient, bite-sized embodiment of a vast and terrifying spiritual problem. So as you picture that courtroom in Macon with learned men in robes gravely discussing the legal rights of snails, you see the medieval worldview in miniature. It's a world where nothing is just a thing. A snail, it's a potential sacrilegious squatter. A pig isn't just a pig, it's a potential murderer. Every corner of creation was subject to the same moral and legal scrutiny. And this incredibly thorough and incredibly strange system of justice had to be paid for. We've toured the courtrooms, witnessed the sentences, and marveled at the legal gymnastics required to prosecute a snail. But amid all this high-minded, theological drama, there's a very mundane, very practical question that often gets overlooked. Who paid for all this? These trials were not cheap. They involved court officials, clerks, lawyers, bailiffs, and sometimes even executioners. There were travel expenses for priests sent to admonish caterpillars. And as we saw with the pig of Falaise, there was the rather significant cost of jailing and feeding an animal defendant while it awaited its day in court. Justice, especially when it involves livestock, has overheads. The answer is simple, and for anyone who has ever paid taxes, deeply familiar the public paid, the costs of these trials were borne by the community. The town or the diocese would have to allocate funds from its treasury to cover all the expenses associated with bringing a rogue animal to justice. This fact is one of the most concrete pieces of evidence we have that these trials were real, official, and taken seriously. You don't create a budget line item for something you consider a joke. The surviving financial accounts from medieval towns and churches are a treasure trove for historians. Tucked away between entries for road repairs and a new roof for the church, you can find expenses like for the feed and lodging of the pig, held in the town jail for 3 weeks, or to Mate Regine for his services as defense counsel for the termites infesting the chapel. So many pence, or my personal favorite, from the records of the pig of Falaise, for a new pair of gloves for the executioner to ensure he could handle the pig properly. So many deniers. This last one is a beautiful little detail. The executioner needed new gloves to do his job, and the town paid for them. It's so specific, so bureaucratic, that it breathes life into the whole affair. It wasn't just a wild mob lynching an animal. It was a state-sanctioned procedure with a paper trail. This brings up a wonderfully niche fact about the economics of animal trials, the property dilemma. When a pig was executed, its body was typically not returned to the owner. It was often confiscated by the local lord or the court as a kind of legal fee. However, there was a problem. In many places, there was a strong superstition against eating the flesh of an executed animal. It was considered tainted, not just physically, but morally. So what did they do with the carcass? Sometimes it was buried or burned. But in one recorded case, the authorities, ever practical, decided to donate the body of an executed pig to a local leper colony, on the assumption that the lepers wouldn't mind eating cursed meat. In another instance, the carcass was given to the local dogs. It's a grim but fascinating glimpse into the practicalities that followed the high-minded legal drama. The fact that the public had to for these trials leads to another historical debate. Did everyone approve of this? Was there any grumbling from the taxpayers about their hard-earned money being spent to buy a waistcoat for a condemned pig? It's hard to know for sure, as the voices of ordinary peasants and townspeople are rarely recorded in the official documents. However, some historians argue that these trials, far from being an unpopular expense, might have been seen as a necessary public good, like funding the city watch or maintaining the town well. In a world where a pig's crime could be seen as a rupture in the cosmic order, paying for the trial was like paying for a form of spiritual insurance. It was the price of keeping your community in good standing with God. The trial wasn't a frivolous expense. It was an essential ritual for restoring balance and ensuring future prosperity. To not hold the trial would be to invite divine wrath, which would be far more costly than a few shillings for pig feed. Other historians, however, suspect there must have been some resentment. They argue that the high cost of some trials, especially the protracted ecclesiastical cases against pests, might have been a source of tension between the laity and the church. Imagine being a farmer whose crops have been destroyed by weevils. You go to the church for help, and they initiate a long, expensive legal process that involves hiring lawyers for the weevils, sending priests on multiple trips to the fields, and endless days of court hearings, all of which you are helping to pay for through your tithes. And at the end of it all, the weevils are still there. You might start to question whether this is the most effective use of community resources. This tension over cost and efficacy might have been one of the slow, grinding forces that eventually lead to the decline of the practice. As people began to look for more practical and cheaper solutions to their problems, The idea of a full-blown legal trial for a swarm of insects may have started to seem less like a spiritual necessity and more like an expensive folly. But for centuries, it was the accepted way. It was the price of order, a public expense that public good a grand moral lesson for all to see. The costs have been paid, the sentence has been carried out, and the town's budget has been duly noted with the expense of new gloves for the executioner. It's clear these trials were a serious official business. But they were also more than that. They were a form of theater, a grand, public performance with a script, actors, and a powerful moral message for the audience. And the audience was everyone. Every aspect of the trial, from the initial arrest to the final execution, was designed to be as public as possible. The trial of the pig of Falaise wasn't held in a stuffy, private courtroom. It was held on a scaffold in the main square, the procession of the accused animal through the streets, the gathering of witnesses, the pronouncement of the sentence from a high platform. All of this ensured that the maximum number of people would see and hear what was happening. This wasn't just for entertainment, though it certainly must have been a grimly fascinating spectacle. The primary purpose was didactic. The trial was a lesson, a sermon acted out in real life, designed to reinforce the social and moral order of the community. So what was the lesson? On the most basic level, it was a simple warning about controlling your property. When a farmer saw his neighbor's pig being dressed in a waistcoat and hanged, the message was crystal clear: keep your animals penned up. It was a brutal but effective public service announcement about civic responsibility and the dangers of negligence. The shame and financial loss suffered by the owner of the condemned animal were a powerful deterrent to others. But the lesson went much deeper than that. The trial was a vivid, public affirmation of the community's values. By putting an animal on trial for murder, the community was loudly and publicly stating that murder was the ultimate crime, a violation so profound that even a brute beast must be held accountable for it. It was a way of drawing a thick. On one side was order law and the sanctity of human life. On the other side was chaos, violence, and sin. The pig had crossed that line, and the trial was the act of dragging it back and making an example of it. This is where we encounter a very interesting and somewhat niche concept from legal anthropology: the idea of the monster trial. In this view, the animal on trial isn't just an animal. It has been transformed by its crime into a monster, a creature that embodies the community's deepest fears. The pig is no longer just a pig, it's a symbol of unchecked violence. The rooster that laid an egg is no longer a chicken. It's a vessel for demonic evil, and purging the monster from the community's midst. It's a way for the society to look its own fears in the face and then, through a structured, legal process, destroy them. And this brings us back to the great historical debate: was this all for show? The public theater interpretation of these trials is one of the most compelling. Proponents of this view argue that the animal's actual guilt or the nuances of the legal arguments were secondary. The main point was the performance itself. The trial was a piece of state-sponsored propaganda. The key elements of this performance were: first, the procession publicly parading the monster through the streets showed that the authorities were in control. The chaos was captured and contained. Second, the judgment, the solemn, public pronouncement of the verdict, reaffirmed the power and justice of the law. It showed that even in the face of a horrifying and unnatural event, the system worked. Third, the punishment, the execution, was the climax, the final, visceral act of purification. By destroying the monster in a public ceremony, the community purged itself of the pollution of the crime and restored the divine order. This interpretation suggests that the target audience for this lesson was not as was sometimes stated, the other animals. The other pigs brought to the execution in Falaise were not there to learn a lesson. They were props, there to enhance the spectacle for the human audience. The real lesson was for the people watching. It was a reminder of their place in the world, the rules they lived by, and the terrible consequences of breaking them. The animals' trial was a distorted reflection of their own human justice system. It was a way for the society to look at its own rules about crime and punishment, but through the slightly less threatening lens of an animal defendant. It was a civics lesson, taught with a pig and a noose instead of a book. But underlying all of this, the law, the theater, the cost was one single, massive philosophical question that haunted the entire enterprise. As we stand in the shadows of the crowded square, watching this elaborate legal theater unfold, we have to pull on a thread that runs through every single one of these cases. It's a question that preoccupied medieval theologians, philosophers, and lawyers, and it's the intellectual bedrock upon which the entire practice of animal trials was built. The question is this: do animals have souls? Or, to be more precise, what kind of souls do they have? Because the answer to that question determines everything. If an animal is just a mindless automaton made of flesh and instinct, a biological machine, then trying it for a crime is as absurd as putting a rock on trial for falling down a hill. But if an animal possesses some kind of soul, some spark of awareness or moral capacity, then the entire picture changes. The medieval Christian view on this was complex and far from unified. On one hand, the dominant school of thought, heavily influenced by thinkers like St. Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas, held that there was a clear hierarchy. Humans, created in the image of God, possessed a rational soul. This was an immortal soul, capable of reason, free will, moral choice, and, crucially, salvation. It was this rational soul that separated humanity from the rest of creation. Animals, in this view, had something different. They were believed to possess a sensitive soul or an animal soul. This soul gave them the ability to move, to feel pleasure and pain, to have instincts and appetites. It allowed a dog to feel affection, or a bull to feel rage. But, and this is the key distinction, this animal soul was not immortal. It was not capable of abstract reason or moral deliberation. When the animal died, its soul simply ceased to exist. So, if an animal can't reason and has no moral compass, how can it be held responsible for a crime? This is the central paradox. And the courts and theologians came up with some ingenious, if contorted, ways to get around it. One fascinating workaround was the idea that the devil could temporarily possess an animal. In this scenario, the animal itself wasn't evil, but it had become a vessel for a demonic intelligence. The court wasn't really trying the pig, it was trying the demon that was using the pig as a puppet. The execution of the animal was therefore a form of exorcism, a way of destroying the demon's earthly vessel. The case of the rooster of Basel fits perfectly into this model. The rooster wasn't guilty of being a rooster. It was guilty of allowing itself to be used by Satan for his nefarious egg-laying purposes. This brings us to a wonderfully strange niche belief from the period, the idea that certain animals were more susceptible to demonic influence than others. Cats, especially black cats, were famously associated with witchcraft and the devil. Goats, with their cloven hooves and beards, were often seen as symbols of Satan himself. And pigs, because of the biblical story where Jesus cast demons into a herd of swine, were seen as particularly vulnerable to becoming vehicles for evil spirits. So, when a pig committed a crime, the idea that it was possessed was not a huge leap for the medieval imagination. But the demonic possession theory didn't cover all cases. So another line of reasoning emerged, and it's a subject of intense debate among historians of philosophy and law. This theory suggests that some medieval thinkers did, in fact, believe that animals had a rudimentary form of moral agency. They saw the animal world as a distorted mirror of the human one. They saw pride in the lion, cunning in the fox, and gluttony in the pig. They believed that animals were subject to the same basic moral laws of creation as humans, even if they understood them only dimly. This view argued that when God gave Adam dominion over the animals in the Garden of Eden, that dominion came with a kind of shared legal framework. The animals were subjects in God's kingdom, just like humans, but of a lower rank. Therefore, they were subject to the king's laws. When a pig murdered a child, it wasn't just breaking a human rule, it was violating the divine peace of God's kingdom. It was an act of rebellion against the established order. The trial was therefore the act of the king's court, represented by the magistrate or bishop bringing a rebellious subject to justice. This interpretation helps explain the intense focus on legal procedure. If the trial was just an exorcism, you wouldn't need a defense lawyer. But if it was a trial of a legal subject, then all the trappings of a fair trial were essential to make the verdict valid in the eyes of God. So which was it? Were these trials exorcisms of demon-possessed beasts? Or were they criminal proceedings against lowly but legally recognized subjects of God's kingdom? The answer is that it was likely a messy combination of both, varying from case to case and from region to region. The medieval mind was perfectly capable of holding both of these seemingly contradictory ideas at the same time. The pig was both a dumb beast and a moral agent. It was both a simple animal and a vessel for Satan. It was this very ambiguity, this blurring of the lines, that made the trials possible in the first place. But not every animal was found guilty. Sometimes, against all odds, the system worked, and an animal was declared innocent. The courtroom is packed. The evidence has been presented. The defendant stands silent, perhaps twitching its long ears, entirely unaware of the gravity of the situation. The verdict, as in so many of these cases, seems like a foregone conclusion. An animal has caused harm, the community is outraged, and the legal machinery has been grinding its way towards a predictable grim outcome. But then, just occasionally, something remarkable happens. The court, after careful deliberation, declares not guilty. Cases of acquittal are rare in the annals of animal trials, which makes them all the more fascinating. They are the exception that proves the rule, rather. They prove that the rule was a genuine, functioning legal process, at least in the minds of those who administered it. A trial with only one possible outcome is not a trial. It's a ceremony. The existence of acquittals shows that there was, at least in some cases, a real possibility of the animal being exonerated. One of the most famous cases of animal acquittal took place in the French village of Saint Julien in 1587. The defendants were a swarm of weevils accused of devastating the local vineyards. The case dragged on for an incredible 8 months, a testament to the meticulous, if painfully slow, nature of the ecclesiastical courts. The weevils were, of course, given a lawyer. The usual arguments were made. The defense proposed the relocation compromise, offering to have his clients leave if a suitable alternative habitat was provided. The townspeople made a counter-offer of a plot of land, but the defense rejected it, arguing that the land was barren and unsuitable for a self-respecting community of weevils. The legal wrangling went back and forth. But in the end, the court was unable to reach a guilty verdict. The defense had successfully argued that the weevils, as creatures of God, had a natural right to sustenance, and the humans had not adequately proven their exclusive right to the grapes. The case was eventually dropped. The weevils, through the tireless efforts of their human lawyer, were effectively acquitted. But perhaps the most charming story of animal innocence comes not from a swarm of insects, but from a single donkey. The details of the case are sparse, more legend than verifiable fact, but the story itself is a beautiful illustration of the strange moral logic at play. The tale goes that a man was caught in a barn committing a sin of criminal intimacy with a donkey. The man was, of course, swiftly condemned to death. But under the law of the time, the animal involved in such a crime was also considered guilty and was supposed to be executed alongside the human. The donkey's fate seemed sealed. This is where the story takes a turn. The local convent, the nuns of a nearby religious house, decided to intervene. They drafted a formal petition to the court on behalf of the donkey. This document is a small masterpiece of compassionate, if slightly surreal, legal reasoning. In their petition, the nuns attested to the donkey's good character. They had known the donkey for many years, they wrote. It had always been a virtuous and well-behaved animal, both at home and in the fields. It had never given anyone any cause for complaint. They certified, in writing, that they had always seen it to be a creature of good and honest life, without a hint of vice. The crime, they argued, was entirely the fault of the human man. The donkey was an innocent, unwilling victim. This is a wonderful niche detail, a character reference for a donkey, written by a convent of nuns. It's a testament to a worldview where an animal could possess a character in a moral sense, a reputation that could be vouched for in a court of law. Amazingly, the court was persuaded. The judges considered the nuns' testimony. They weighed the donkey's long history of good behavior against this one unfortunate incident, and they issued a formal letter of remission, officially pardoning the donkey. The animal was acquitted and spared the fate of its human co-defendant. It was set free, its good name restored, all thanks to the testimony of a group of kindly nuns who believed in its virtue. What do these acquittals tell historians? They are a powerful piece of evidence against the theory that these trials were pure show, mere theater with a predetermined outcome. If the verdict was always a foregone conclusion, there would be no need for an 8-month trial for weevils, and no reason for a court to even consider a petition from a group of nuns. These cases suggest that the people involved, the judges and lawyers, truly believed in the system they were administering. They believed in the principles of evidence, testimony, and legal argument. They were willing to let the process lead them to an unpopular or unexpected conclusion. The acquittal of the donkey shows a court capable of nuance, able to distinguish between a willing accomplice and an unwilling victim, even when the victim was a different species. These rare moments of legal mercy shine a light on the best-case scenario of this strange legal world. It was a world that, for all its absurdity, took the concept of justice so seriously that it was willing to extend it to the lowliest of creatures. It could, on occasion, look at a donkey implicated in a terrible crime and see not a monster, but a victim, a creature of good and honest life that deserved to be saved. But not everyone, even at the time, was so convinced. There were voices that looked at this entire practice and saw not justice, but madness. While the courtrooms of Europe were busy debating the legal rights of weevils and the moral character of donkeys, not everyone was swept up in the solemnity of the proceedings. Even in an age of deep faith and widespread superstition, there were people who looked at a pig in a waistcoat or a lawyer addressing a swarm of rats and thought, "This is completely, undoubtedly insane." These voices of reason were few and far between, and often quiet, but they were there, a skeptical counterpoint to the mainstream madness. Finding these dissenting voices in the historical record is difficult. The official documents, being written by the court officials themselves, tend to present the trials with unwavering gravity. The chroniclers of the time were more interested in recording the strange and portentous events than in questioning their underlying logic. To find the critics, you often have to read between the lines, looking for hints of satire, skepticism, and outright mockery. One of the earliest and most notable critics was a Swiss-French jurist named Pierre Arrot. Writing in the late 16th century, right in the heyday of these trials, he was one of the few legal scholars to openly question the practice. Arrot was a man of the law, but he was also a man of emerging humanist thought. He looked at the legal basis for animal trials and found it wanting. He argued, quite simply, that law is a contract between rational beings. It requires understanding, consent, and the ability to reason, qualities that animals, in his view, clearly lacked. To apply human laws to beasts was, for him, a confusion of categories, a fundamental legal error. He wrote with a tone of deep exasperation, describing the practice as a ridiculous and inept imitation of human justice. He couldn't understand why his learned colleagues were wasting their time and intellectual energy on such a charade. He was, in essence, the man at the Surrealist art exhibition loudly declaring that the emperor has no clothes. Then there were the satirists. The great French writer François Rabelais, in his classic satirical novel Gargantua and Pantagruel, took a gleeful swipe at the whole affair. He wrote a famous chapter parodying the career of Bartholomew Chasny, the great defender of the rats. In Rabelais's version, a corpulent, self-important judge named Bridal Goose decides his cases by rolling dice. When questioned about his methods, he launches into a long, rambling, and utterly nonsensical defense, citing obscure legal precedents and ridiculous theological arguments, much like the real-life lawyers in animal trials. The parody was so sharp because it was so close to the truth. Rabelais was holding up a mirror to the legal profession, showing them the absurdity that lay just beneath the surface of their solemn pronouncements. This brings us to a wonderfully niche historical tidbit, the case of the mock trial. Some historians believe that some of the more outlandish recorded trials might not have been real at all, but were actually academic exercises or a form of satirical theater performed by law students. In the medieval university system, students would often hold mock trials or moots to practice their legal skills. They would take on absurd hypothetical cases to sharpen their wits and show off their rhetorical flair. It is plausible that a case like the People versus the Snails might have begun its life as a farcical moot court competition, and its story was later mistaken for a real historical event. This is a point of hot debate among historians. Are some of the craziest animal trial stories simply the medieval equivalent of a college prank that got written down? One camp argues that the evidence for the trials, particularly the financial records, is too strong. You don't budget public money for a joke. They insist that even the most bizarre cases, like the Rooster of Basel, were deadly serious. But the other camp suggests that the line between serious trial and satirical performance might have been blurrier than we think. They point to medieval traditions like the Feast of Fools, an annual festival where social hierarchies were temporarily overturned. A corboy would be elected bishop for a day, and a donkey would sometimes be led into the church. In a culture that had a place for this kind of ritualized, carnivalesque mockery of authority, it's not a huge leap to imagine that some animal trials might have had a satirical, performative element to them. Perhaps the trial of the weevils wasn't about the weevils at all, but a way for the townspeople to poke fun at the slow, convoluted, and often ineffective legal system they lived under. These early critics and satirists were planting seeds of doubt. They were introducing a new, powerful idea into the cultural conversation, the idea that some things are just what they are. A pig is just a pig. A rockful is just a rockful. An egg laid by a rooster is just a weird biological fluke. This may seem obvious to us, but it was a revolutionary concept in a world where everything was a sign, a symbol, a message from the divine. More secular, and frankly, less interesting worldview. They were the first whisper of the Enlightenment, a new way of thinking that would eventually spell the end for this entire, bizarre legal world. The skeptical voices of men like Pierre Erot and the sharp satire of Rabelais bring us to a fascinating, unperplexing question that historians still love to argue about over dusty books and lukewarm coffee. Were some of these trials an elaborate, deadpan joke? Was the entire, solemn process, the lawyers, the witnesses, the theological arguments a form of complex, high-concept legal satire that we are just too far removed from to fully understand? This is a seductive theory. It's comforting to think that the people of the past weren't really as backwards as they sometimes seem, and that they were, in fact, in on the joke. The idea is that the lawyers and judges, being highly educated and intelligent men, couldn't possibly have taken this all seriously. They must have been using the framework of the animal trial as a vehicle for something else, to critique the law, to mock their less educated countrymen, or simply to engage in a kind of intellectual play. The career of Bartholomew Chasney is often held up as exhibit A for this argument. Could a man of his obvious brilliance really have believed in the legal personhood of rats? Or was he using the fear of cats' defense as a masterful reductio ad absurdum, a way of demonstrating the inherent foolishness of the law by following its logic to a ridiculous, but inescapable conclusion? In this view, Chasney is not a sincere lawyer. He's a brilliant performance artist, using the courtroom as his stage and the law as his medium. His defense of the rats becomes a satirical masterpiece, a subtle act of intellectual rebellion disguised as diligent legal practice. We can imagine a small circle of these educated jurists, perhaps after the trial, sharing a bottle of wine and having a good laugh at the whole charade. Can you believe they bought the argument about needing to post a bond for the cats, one might say, and the others would chuckle into their goblets. It's a pleasing image, as it makes these historical figures seem more like us, witty, ironic, and aware of the absurdity of their world. This leads to a niche theory known as legal formalism as parody. The argument goes that the more formal, the more procedural, the more by the book these trials became, the more satirical they were. By obsessively adhering to every tiny legal nicety when dealing with a pig or a snail, the court was creating a parody of its own self-importance. The very seriousness of the process was the punchline. It was a joke so deadpan that it took centuries for anyone to get it. But as appealing as this theory is, many, if not most, historians are deeply skeptical of it. They argue that we are committing the classic historical error of projecting our own modern mindset onto the past. We live in an ironic, secular age, so we look for irony and secularism in the past. But the medieval and early modern world was, for the most part, profoundly, intensely sincere. The counter-argument is that these people were not like us. Their entire mental landscape was different. They lived in the enchanted world we've been exploring, a world drenched in meaning where the supernatural was a daily reality. For them, a rooster laying an egg was a terrifying demonic portent. A pig committing murder was a rupture in God's creation. The law was not just a human convention. It was a reflection of divine order. To apply it to animals was not absurd. It was a sacred duty. These historians point to the sheer volume of the trials, the decades and even centuries over which they occurred, and the immense expense and effort that went into them. Jokes, they argue, don't usually have a budget. Satire doesn't typically involve a paid executioner. The evidence of the financial records, the solemnity of the written verdicts, and the writings of serious legal scholars like Chasney himself, who wrote about animal trials with no discernible hint of irony, all point to the conclusion that they meant it. This debate itself is a wonderful illustration of the challenge of history. We have the same set of facts. A pig was tried, a lawyer defended it, the town paid the bill. One historian looks at these facts and sees a sincere, if bizarre, act of justice. Another looks at the very same facts and sees a brilliant, subtle piece of social satire. The truth is likely somewhere in the messy middle. It's probable that motivations varied wildly. Others may have had an element of performative exaggeration. A lawyer like Chasney might have been both a sincere believer in the system and a brilliant showman who enjoyed pushing its boundaries. The question of was it all a joke may be unanswerable, but the debate itself forces us to confront the profound otherness of the past. It reminds us that their definition of serious and our definition of absurd are two very different things. And this gap in understanding was about to get much, much wider as a new wave of thinking began to sweep across Europe, a way of seeing the world that had no room for talking donkeys or demonic chickens. The world of animal trials, with its strange and wonderful logic, could not last forever. Like a magnificent but poorly built medieval cathedral, its foundations were slowly being eroded by new ideas. The shift was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping change in the intellectual climate of Europe. The enchanted world, where everything was a sign and every creature had its place in a divine Rama, began to fade, replaced by a world that was quieter, more mechanical, and to our modern eyes more familiar. This was the dawn of the Enlightenment. It didn't begin with a direct attack on animal trials. No one wrote a best-selling pamphlet titled "Stop Prosecuting Snails." Instead, the change came from a much deeper level. Philosophers and scientists began to ask new kinds of questions, not about the meaning of things, but about the mechanisms of things. The big question was no longer why did God do this, but how does this work? One of the first major shifts was the rise of empiricism. Thinkers like Francis Bacon in England championed the idea that knowledge should be based on observation and evidence from the real world. You shouldn't decide that a rooster's egg is evil based on an old legend in a book. You should dissect the rooster. You should study the egg. You should look for a natural, physical explanation first. This new scientific method was a powerful solvent for superstition. It replaced myth with biology, divine portents with observable phenomena. This new way of thinking created a world that was, in a way, less scary, but also less magical. A comet was no longer a divine warning. It was a ball of ice and rock following a predictable orbit, as described by the new laws of physics being formulated by men like Isaac Newton. A two-headed lamb was not a monster sent by Satan. It was a developmental anomaly, a sad but natural error in the process of gestation. The world was slowly being disenchanted. The invisible layer of supernatural meaning that had covered everything was being peeled back, revealing a clockwork universe underneath. In this new intellectual landscape, the very premise of an animal trial started to seem not just wrong, but nonsensical. How can you try a pig for murder if murder requires malice aforethought? And malice is a complex mental state that a pig, a creature of simple instinct, cannot possess. How can you excommunicate rats if excommunication is a spiritual punishment? And rats are just biological organisms with no immortal soul to condemn. The old legal and theological arguments that had propped up the system began to crumble under the weight of these new, more skeptical questions. A fascinating little detail from this period of transition is the changing nature of legal arguments themselves. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, you start to see lawyers in the few remaining animal trial cases using these new scientific ideas in their defense. A lawyer for a bewitched horse might bring in a veterinarian to testify that the horse's strange behavior was caused by a physical illness, not demonic possession. They were fighting superstition with science right there in the courtroom. This shift in thinking also led to a change in how people dealt with practical problems. If your crops were being eaten by pests, you were gradually less likely to go to the bishop and more likely to consult a book on new farming techniques. Agricultural science was beginning to offer more effective, if less dramatic, solutions than an ecclesiastical curse. Crop rotation, pesticides in their early forms, and better methods of grain storage proving to be more reliable than excommunicating weevils. The church court, once the last resort for a desperate farmer, was becoming irrelevant. Historians still debate the exact timeline and cause of the decline. Was it a top-down change, driven by elite philosophers and scientists, whose ideas eventually trickled down to the general populace? Or was it a bottom-up change, driven by ordinary people who simply found that these old rituals no longer worked and were too expensive to maintain? The top-down theory argues that the intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment was the primary driver. The educated elite, the judges, lawyers, and bishops who administered the trials stopped believing in the system's premises, and so the system withered away. The bottom-up theory, however, suggests that ordinary people simply lost faith in the process for practical reasons. They saw that the curses didn't stop the rats and the trials didn't stop the pigs from being dangerous. They got tired of paying for these expensive, ineffective rituals and started looking for solutions that actually worked. The system didn't die because a philosopher wrote a book. It died because it stopped being useful. Most likely, it was a combination of both. The new ideas from the top gave people the intellectual framework to question the old ways, and the practical failures at the bottom gave them the motivation to do so. The world was changing. The great chain of being was rusting away, and one French philosopher was about to deliver the final, decisive blow to the idea of the animal soul, a blow from which the practice of animal trials would never recover. The intellectual ground has been shifting for a century. The old enchanted world is fading, and a new, more mechanical one is taking its place. The practice of animal trials is already in decline, looking more and more like a relic of a superstitious past. And then, in the mid-17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes picks up his pen and deals the entire concept its philosophical death blow. Descartes, famous for his statement "I think, therefore I am," was one of the key architects of this new, modern worldview. He was obsessed with certainty, with finding a foundation for knowledge that could not be doubted. And in his quest for certainty, he drew a very sharp, very bright line between the mind and the body, between the thinking self and the physical world. For Descartes, the defining characteristic of humanity, the very essence of our being, was the mind, the res cogite ens, or thinking thing. And animals, in his revolutionary and controversial view, did not have one. Descartes argued that animals were, in essence, complex biological machines. He called them beast machines. They were automata, crafted by God with incredible skill, but automata nonetheless. They had bodies, senses, and could perform complex actions. A dog could appear to be happy, a cat could appear to be in pain. But for Descartes, this was an illusion. These were not signs of an inner mental life, of consciousness or feeling. They were simply the mechanical responses of a complex biological apparatus, like the chimes of a clock or the movements of a puppet. When a dog yelped after being kicked, it wasn't feeling pain in the way a human feels pain. It was just a hydraulic and pneumatic system reacting to a stimulus. The yelp was no more a sign of suffering than the sound a spring makes when it's struck. This was a radical, and to many, a chilling idea. It stripped the animal world of all interiority, all feeling, all consciousness. It turned a living, breathing creature into a mere object, a piece of intricate clockwork wrapped in flesh and fur. This beast-machine theory had profound implications for the law. If an animal is just a machine, then it can no more be guilty of a crime than a faulty cart that rolls down a hill and injures someone. The cart isn't guilty. It's just broken. Likewise, a pig that attacks a child isn't a murderer. It's a malfunctioning machine. You don't put a machine on trial. You don't give it a lawyer or sentence it to be hanged. You might take it apart to see what went wrong, or you might simply destroy it to prevent it from causing more damage, but you don't treat it as a moral agent. The entire legal and theological framework of the animal trial becomes utterly meaningless. This Cartesian view provides a wonderfully niche insight into the history of science and ethics, the practice of vivisection. Descartes' theory was used to justify the live dissection of animals for scientific research, a practice that became more common in the following centuries. Scientists who subscribed to his view could cut into a living dog and believe that its cries and struggles were not signs of agony, but merely the meaningless convulsions of a machine. It was a dark and brutal consequence of this new, sharp division between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom. Of course, Descartes' view was not universally accepted. It sparked a fierce and long-lasting debate. Many other philosophers and everyday people were horrified by the idea. They looked at their own pets, their loyal dogs and affectionate cats, and simply could not accept that they were unfeeling machines. Critics argued that Descartes' theory was counterintuitive and cruel. They pointed to the obvious signs of emotion in animals: joy, fear, loyalty, grief as evidence of a rich inner life. This debate about the nature of animal consciousness, sparked by Descartes, continues to this day in the fields of philosophy, cognitive science, and animal rights. Are animals conscious? Do they suffer? What moral obligations do we have towards them? The questions that were once debated in a courtroom over a single criminal pig are now debated in scientific journals and legislative halls over the rights of entire species. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Cartesian view, or at least a simplified version of it, gained enormous traction among the educated elite. It provided a neat, tidy, scientific reason to dismiss the old ways. It confirmed what the new spirit of the age was already suggesting, that the line between human and animal was not a blurry, permeable boundary, but a high, impenetrable wall. Humans had minds, souls, and morals. With this philosophical framework in place, the practice of animal trials no longer looked just old-fashioned or strange. It looked fundamentally irrational, a category error of the highest order. It was a relic from a time when people didn't understand the basic nature of reality. The final nail had been hammered into the coffin. The curtain was falling on one of the strangest chapters in legal history. The stage is now empty. The philosophical and scientific revolutions have swept through, clearing away the old props and scenery. The enchanted world has given way to a mechanical one. The idea of putting an animal in the dock which for centuries seemed like a logical, if sometimes strange, necessity, now seems like a relic from a distant, almost alien past. The practice of animal trials doesn't end with a dramatic flourish, a final, definitive ruling that declares them illegal. The last recorded cases pop up in the late 18th and even, in a few isolated instances, the early 19th century. They are increasingly rare, seen as bizarre local eccentricities rather than a functioning part of the mainstream legal system. A village in a remote mountain valley might still go through the motions of trying a destructive bull, but it would be seen by the wider world as a quaint and backward curiosity. The last known trial of an animal leading to execution seems to have been in Switzerland in 1788, where a dog was sentenced to death for biting a man. By the time the French Revolution arrives with its talk of the rights of man, the idea of the rights of pigs has been thoroughly laughed out of the courtroom. The law books are gradually rewritten. The old precedents established by men like Bartholomew Chastney are quietly dropped. The new legal codes that emerge in the 19th century, like the Napoleonic Code, are built on the Enlightenment's foundation of reason, individual human rights, and a clear distinction between persons and property. In this new system, an animal is firmly in the category of property. If your dog bites someone, you are liable. The law deals with the owner, not the dog. The dog might be put down, but this is framed as a matter of public safety, a form of pest control, not a legal execution. The language of morality, of guilt and sin, is completely stripped away. And so this entire extraordinary chapter of history comes to a gentle close. For nearly 1,000 years, humans had looked at the animal world and seen a reflection of their own, a world of heroes and villains, of saints and sinners, of moral agents who could be praised, shamed, unpunished. They had created a legal system of breathtaking strangeness and complexity to manage that relationship. They had spent vast sums of money, employed some of their best legal minds, and engaged in profound theological debates, all in an effort to bring a semblance of human justice to the animal kingdom. What is the final legacy of all this? On one level, it's a collection of fantastic, almost unbelievable stories. The tale of the pig in the waistcoat, the lawyer who used cats as a legal shield, the rooster burned at the stake, the donkey acquitted on a character reference from nuns. These are historical curiosities, amusing anecdotes that remind us of how different the past was. They are a testament to the incredible variety of human belief in the strange paths our societies have walked. But, on a deeper level, the story of the animal trials is a mirror. It reflects back at us our own enduring struggle to make sense of our place in the world and our relationship with the other creatures who share it. The questions they wrestled with are still, in many ways, our questions. What is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of consciousness? What is the basis of morality? Where is the line between instinct and reason, between person and thing? We no longer put animals on trial, but our legal systems are still grappling with their status. We have laws against animal cruelty, which implicitly recognize that they can suffer. We debate the rights of primates in medical research. We argue about the conservation of endangered species and the ethics of industrial farming. We are still trying to figure out what we owe to the animals. The courtroom may have changed, the language may be different, but the fundamental dilemma persists. The story of the animal trials is a humbling reminder that our own worldview, our own sense of what is logical and rational, is not timeless. It is a product of our specific moment in history. The things we take for granted, the clear line between human and animal, the mechanical nature of the universe are relatively new ideas. For a very long time, people saw the world in a completely different way. To them, their world was just as real, just as logical as ours is to us. And so, we leave this strange legal zoo behind. The spectral figures of the pig, the rat, the rooster, and the donkey fade back into the mists of history. They leave us with a sense of wonder, a touch of absurdity, and perhaps a newfound appreciation for the simple, straightforward sanity of our own time. Or perhaps they leave us with a nagging question: what parts of our own world, what deeply held beliefs that we consider to be obvious and true, will seem just as strange and ridiculous to the people of the future. And so, the courtroom of the past grows quiet. The voices of the lawyers and the judges, the rustling of the crowds, and the soft, confused noises of the animal defendants all fade into a gentle, dreamlike silence. The story has been told, and now it settles like dust motes in a shaft of moonlight, finding its own peaceful rest in the archives of your mind. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand. You can let the details drift away like scattered pages carried on a soft night breeze. Perhaps all that remains is a single, curious image: a pig in a waistcoat, a lawyer addressing an empty room, a donkey standing proudly with its name cleared. Let these images soften and blur, their sharp edges dissolving as you sink a little deeper into comfort, a little closer to the edge of sleep. The world of these trials, with all its strange logic and solemn absurdity, was a world trying to impose order on chaos. But here, in this quiet moment, there is no need for order. There is no need for judgment. There is only the simple, peaceful fact of your own gentle breathing, rising and falling in an easy, natural rhythm. Allow that rhythm to be your only guide now, as it carries you away from the shores of story and out into the calm, quiet sea of your own dreams. The final word has been whispered. If your mind is still gently stirring, you're welcome to drift into another of my stories. If not, I wish you a deep and peaceful slumber. Good night.